Hey everybody, it's Mr. Platt. We're going to try this for the first time, verbalizing one of these PowerPoints, so bear with me as we try and work ourselves through this. First one that we're going to look at is Teddy Roosevelt, the progressive. We'll examine Teddy Roosevelt, the imperialist, next week, but Teddy Roosevelt, the progressive, today. So Teddy Roosevelt really pushed what he called the strenuous life and this idea of rugged individualism. That you can really strengthen yourself and everyone rises on their own merit. He was born into a wealthy New York family in 1858. His father was already connected in powerful political and business circles by that point, and they grew up in a pretty prominent family up to that point. His father was, in fact, rich enough and privileged enough that he was able to pay someone to go ahead and take his place in the American Civil War. This is something that always hurt Teddy Roosevelt, as he looked at that as kind of a stain on his own honor. In a lot of ways, people would say that that's probably what drove him to go to such lengths to fight for this country and become, as we look at a little bit later in the next chapter, the strong imperialist that he was. But he did grow up in a pretty comfortable New York, moderate wealthy, family. I would say that there is one event that happens early on in his life that really helps shape him as well, and that's him having asthma. He was a sickly young man. From an early age, he was small and sickly, and his parents babied him a little bit, but he decided he was going to take it upon himself that he was going to work his way right through this, and he used asthma not as a crutch, but as almost a springboard. He decided he was going to push himself through by running, by hiking, by boxing, by always being on the move, always constantly working the body, and eventually, as you're going to see, kind of the mind. He was able to, from a young age, his parents were able to, get him private tutors, were able to take him on family travels to Europe and to North Africa. He was able to afford to be able to go to Harvard University, and even within Harvard University, hang out with some of the real up-and-comers in the prosperous families. He was many things. He was a scientist. He was a historian. He was an outdoorsman. And, he took his love for really science and how things work. He would go ahead and, not just, kill animals, but then he would go ahead and he would examine them later on. He wrote, 10 different books, 5 of them long and lengthy historical histories. He spoke 3 different languages, and he could read 4 others. So this is a guy who, was very much, even though Steiner, he was an intellectual. He wasn't just a rough and tumbler, he was an intellectual. And he was an outdoorsman, right? I mean, he loved to be outdoors, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. He did get his political beginnings by joining the New York legislature and bounced around there during the 1880s. And then on one fateful day, his life and probably his purpose changed. He was happy there. He felt like doing the people's work. And then on the exact same day, a transformative figure in his life, his mother, along with his wife, die in the same house on the same day. Again, you heard me correctly. His wife and his mother die on the same day in the same house. Within a matter of hours, he's upstairs watching his wife die, and then shortly after watching his mother die. At that point, he has one daughter, young Alice, and he sends her off to live with relatives because he just can't deal at this point. So he heads out west. He goes to the Dakota Territory and really tries to find himself out there, and stays out there for about 3 years until he comes back in to New York and decides with renewed purpose that he's going to go ahead and join the fight. And he comes back. He works in the Civil Service Commission. He works eventually then as police commissioner of New York City. And then he moves on to Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he serves in that until 1998, when the United States of America goes to war with Spain in the Spanish-American War, and he resigns his post there just so he can lead an individual group, the Rough Riders, into combat, into the fighting there. He comes back, and all this nationalistic glory is seen now as as a national figure, and he becomes governor of New York in 1999, and that raises his profile even more to the point where he joins the Republican ticket in the year 1900 as William McKinley is running for re-election in 1900, and he chooses Teddy Roosevelt as vice president. But really, he wasn't chosen, by McKinley. He was chosen by the party bosses because the Republican Party, just like the Democratic Party at that point, were really led by special interests. And this is where Teddy Roosevelt, this is why he was chosen. He was seen as someone who was uncontrollable. He was really the only one who would not play the game for the party interests and for big business interests. He kind of called them how he saw them, whether you're on his team or not. And he lived a very righteous life in that way. And the party bosses saw him as someone who was dangerous to the cause because he could not be reasoned with. He could not be bargained with. He was not someone that you could buy, if you will. So in these ways, he was seen as dangerous. And what do you do with someone like that? Well, at this point in 1900, you send them to be vice president because that's where they can kind of go and basically sit there for 4 years and do nothing. It was a very powerless office. It did not do much. And that was seen as a place where they could go ahead and hide him. That was the power of Teddy Roosevelt. They were scared of him. Little did they know, and would they have taken that move if they knew that William McKinley was going to be assassinated in his first year and his second term. I call this the irony, right? Because that's exactly what happens. They try to hide Teddy Roosevelt in the vice presidency, and again on September 6, 1901, William McKinley is assassinated, and Teddy Roosevelt becomes president of the United States. He's actually out west in the time, and they have to find him, and he rides back on horseback a little bit, and then eventually, takes the railroad back to assume the office as William McKinley dies 8 days later. Of infection and a gunshot wound. And Teddy Roosevelt really was, a man in the arena. Again, Teddy Roosevelt was very much the man in the arena. And this is a speech that he wrote when he was out of office in 1910. But I think it gives you a little bit of insight into the kind of person that he was and the presidency that he had. Here's part of it. Quote, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." And Teddy Roosevelt was definitely a man of youth and vigor. He was the youngest president ever to serve. He was only 42 years old when he assumed office. He was not the youngest one ever elected, though. That was JFK, still holds that, as he was elected in 1960 at age 43. Teddy Roosevelt assumed the presidency and then was elected in his own right just 3 years later. And he was one with an unbelievable amount of energy. He wanted to give Americans what he called a square deal, right? He wanted to be fair. So leads us to this idea of image versus reality. Now, Teddy Roosevelt really was, in many ways, a wild man. He really was someone who you don't look at as quite, presidential because of the enthusiasm and the spirit that he held. But in a lot of ways, he was very much a moderate president. If you looked at the actual policies as they went down, he was a moderate. He saw himself as conservative, while many people would look today and look at a lot of his policies as very progressive. But he was always someone who, I would say, had his domestic sights, fixed on the center, if you will. He wanted moderate reform. He wanted it under a tight administrative control, and he was for regulation and reform, rather than the outright overthrow of big business. He wasn't looking to end end it and flip sides, he wanted what he would call a course correction. He wanted to balance the playing field. He wanted a square deal for people, not a free handout, but a square deal. And I would say, ultimately that those kind of were his core beliefs. He believed that if people were given a fair shot, they should be able to rise and fall according to their own merit. He did not believe in handouts, and in fact, when you look at his core beliefs, he was not against people prospering. He was not against the rich getting rich, and in fact, he didn't just fight against them. He would not stick up for poor people in a lot of senses. He didn't believe that they should just have free handouts, or it was the government's job to help them. He believed that he kind of looked at himself as an umpire. He was calling balls and strikes, and he wanted to keep it fair. I want to close this by just kind of examining this family portrait down here as you take a look at it. I think it tells us a lot about the Roosevelt family. You have Teddy, his 6 children, and his wife Edith. Edith is the mother of the younger 5. The oldest, Alice, is there in the middle, and we'll talk about all of them in just a bit. I guess I would look and first I go in there fully recognizing that a picture you're able to pose and kind of set it the way that you want to. But I do find it interesting where they place themselves and how they address the camera, if you will. Let's start off with Teddy. What is Teddy trying to tell us? Well, he's got his famous monocle glasses, and he also has his bow tie. He's well groomed. He's got a nice suit coat. But at the same time, he's also wearing his riding boots, right? So he probably just got done riding on horseback here, and he'd be willing to leave in a second. He also has his cowboy hat in hand. Now, as you see, he's got his 2 youngest sons, right next to him. The youngest leaning into him as Teddy leans back into him as well. Teddy, a pillar of strength, and the son dotingly just kind of laying on his dad's shoulder. The next youngest son is sitting on his lap, right? So obviously there was that affection there. And right behind them, you see Kermit, his oldest son. And Kermit's an interesting character in his own right. He went in to be involved in policy and political, even in military fights over the next couple decades, and ended up getting in many disagreements with Teddy Roosevelt's 5th and distant cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in years to come, as Teddy Roosevelt and Kermit were ardent Republicans, whereas their cousin FDR was probably the most famous of Democrats eventually. His wife Edith, as you can kind of see her proudly here in her nice dress next to her, young daughter and Theodore's son. And then in the background, is Alice. Alice was 17, the oldest of this group. The youngest was 4 as they moved into the White House. And she was quite a wild spirit, really probably got that after her dad as well. But you could see her wearing, kind of the famous clothes of the day, a very well-to-do hat, and I find it interesting that she's not addressing the camera directly. She's standing sideways, but her face is, so it does draw more attention to that hat and also the expression on her face as you kind of look, and she looks like somebody posing for a football picture today. That damned cowboy. That's what Senator from Ohio Mark Hanna called Teddy Roosevelt. Again, the man who would not be controlled when this was a time where parties were dominated by special interests. The makeup of the Democratic and Republican Party in 1900s is pretty interesting. The Democratic Party is still dominating the South, as they have since the end of Reconstruction, where they redeemed or restored the South, however you looked at it. And the Republicans, as they had for a long time, still have a lock on the Northeast and pretty much the Midwest, though that's up for grabs a little bit as well. The part that's really up for grabs is out west. The Republicans have made a lot of inroads, but the Democrats are still fighting for territory out there because of some different issues. And you really see the back and forth between those two parties as they fight for the West and the Midwest to decide whose party will dominate. The Republicans up to this point have pretty much dominated since the end of the Civil War. In fact, there's only been one Democrat that's been in office. That's Grover Cleveland in the late 1800s or 1870s even, sorry. Teddy Roosevelt, the other interesting thing about him is the idea of how he viewed office. Once he took over as president, he was going to fill it with what I would call the best and the brightest, the JFK model, right? Put people in positions of power that are the best at their position, the experts in all of these different categories, whether it be agriculture, whether it be industrialization, whether it be commerce. Put the best and the brightest there, not as what's been done since the 1830s under Andrew Jackson's spoil system, right? The people who helped you get elected and their friends and family, and a place for government's a place for to hand out favors as opposed to do the people's bidding. He changes that, and he really does make it a place where he wants to put the best and brightest that can help the people the most. How's he going to do that? He's going to use what he terms the bully pulpit. He's going to push his message directly to the people. As congressmen and senators kind of laugh at him and look at him and say, hey, we're the ones running the show here. You have no real power. He says, that's fine. If I can't convince you, I'll just convince the American people. And he does. He goes out on these tours, really trying to sell his agenda, sell his points to the people, and then hoping that they would in turn put the pressure on their local congressmen or senators. And this works to great effect for him, and he's really able to take his message to the people. And you see this used by other presidents in the past as well. The president-elect today is really looking, I think, to bring this back, this idea of Teddy Roosevelt taking his message back to the people. We'll see how that turns out for him. It worked out pretty well for Teddy Roosevelt. And I think just to kind of end this one, I wanted to look at, what is his belief in the federal government's role in people's lives? Well, this is breaking precedent, but he believed that the federal government should step in when local and state governments really weren't up to the task, right? They couldn't handle it. It was something that they needed the federal government's help in. He didn't believe they should be involved in everything, but he did believe that they had a major role in people's lives, and that is a break from precedent. In the past, they did not believe, the federal government didn't get involved in people's life on a day-to-day basis or in some of these matters that people would look at as trivial. They got involved in war and peace. They got involved if major disasters happened. But otherwise, they did not get involved in the day-to-day, the blow-to-blow of people. In Teddy Roosevelt's words, he says, it is not the duty of the president, it is the duty of the president to act upon the theory that he is the steward of the people and to assume that he has the legal right to do whatever the needs of the people demand, unless the Constitution forbids it. I think the best example of progressivism I wanted to kind of highlight was Teddy Roosevelt and what he did in the 1902 coal strike. So let me set this up and kind of tell you what's going on. In 1902, again, we're talking about Appalachia here, right? And part of Appalachia resides in Pennsylvania. There's a coal mine, and you have a lot of miners that decide they're done with it. They don't like that they're not getting paid what they think they deserve. They think they're working too long. They think they're working in dangerous conditions. They don't have any benefits, and they decide that if you're not going to deal with this, we're just going to go on strike. The owners aren't even listening to this. They're just not having it. And so what does any kind of powerful group do in order to enact that change? Well, they're going to go ahead and go on strike at the most inopportune time. So what you have happen is 140,000 coal miners go on strike in Pennsylvania in the fall of 1902. And basically, that's how people heat their homes. And the fear is that without this coal being brought up and people being able to use it, that thousands of people could die, right? Freezing to death. And this leads Teddy Roosevelt to go ahead and get involved. And so here were the demands of the coal miners, right? They wanted a 20% raise. They wanted a 9-hour workday. They wanted the right to organize a union. Teddy Roosevelt, he calls both sides to the White House, right? He brings kind of the miners' leaders, and he also brings the owners of the mines in. And they have a couple introductory talks, and they don't go well, and the owners are basically like, well, obviously this didn't work, thanks a lot, but we're out of here. And Teddy Roosevelt basically pulls them aside and says, no, I don't think you understand. We're not done here. You're not leaving until we have something agreed upon, and we get this coal flowing, and everything gets worked out. And he really strong-arms the owners. This is something new. The federal government, if they ever were called to arbitrate between let's call it the owner class and the working class, always up to this point had sided with the owners, right, against the workers. And this is a time when Teddy Roosevelt really tried to say, no, I'm not going to do that. And in fact, this is going to be even, and we're going to get this done. And they do. In the end, they end up getting things worked out. Teddy Roosevelt calls in some experts on both sides. They kind of look at kind of the conditions, what's going on, and they come up with and they arbitrate an agreement, right? They put a commission on it, very progressive thing. They put a commission to decide what would happen. And they end up with the 10, they split the raise, right? They get a 10% raise. They do get the 9-hour workday, and they don't get the right to organize a union, okay? And they can't go on strike for 3 years, but they do get some improved working conditions. Now, why is this important? Why is this an example of progressivism as Teddy Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson saw it afterwards? Well, it did two things. Number one, this incident leads the public to really view that, boy, the federal government's now expected to intervene when their welfare is threatened. Okay, if it's in danger, the expectation is now that the federal government is going to step in and make sure that people are safe. The other thing that it is, and I think this is maybe the most important, this is the idea of progressive philosophy, right? Progressives believe every problem has an answer. Every problem has a solution. Disputes can be handled in an orderly way. All you got to do is get some experts in there. They can look at it, they can diagnose the problem, and they can deal with it, right? People we have experts in all of these different fields. We should use them to guide us in the right direction. But ultimately, logic and this progressive philosophy is going to win out. So while Teddy Roosevelt does a couple things, obviously in his first 3 years, he runs for president in 1904 on his own. As you can see from one of the famous magazines back then called Puck Magazine, they call him Terrible Teddy, right? Waits for the unknown. And no one really wanted to run against him. He was pretty popular at this point. He's seen as a boxer. He's seen as a bruiser by the American public. And they love that. They feel like this is a guy who's going to, what they would say, quote unquote, go to the mat for us. He ends up running in 1904 and he crushes a little known guy named Alton Parker who runs against him. You'll never hear that name again, probably, Alton Parker. And he beats him very handily, 7.5 million to 5 million votes. And this is really the beginning of what I would call the peak of the prime of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. 1904 to 1906 are when a lot of these big things really happen. But he does make probably his biggest, at least political blunder. He does make some mistakes and has some shortfalls, and we'll talk about that a little later. But as far as political blunders goes, boy, oh boy, he decides this night, maybe just because he felt the love of the people and everything else, that he makes a public comment which comes back to haunt him later on. He says, quote, "The wise custom which limits a president to 2 terms regards the substance and not the form. Under no circumstances will I be a candidate for or accept another nomination." So he essentially makes himself a lame duck president. Obviously, as you look at this, it limits what he can do, right? He's only going to be in office until 1908, right? He's assuring the people of that. But the other part is, once people know that, they just try and wait you out, right? I mean, they try and hold off and delay and wait so that you can't effectively govern. And he does run into some of this in his second term. I'd be remiss if we didn't mention muckraking during this time period and the important role that it had in shaping this progressive era. What was it? Well, muckraking was really investigative journalism, if you will, of the day. And they had plenty to dig into. As newspapers were really starting to take their true form in the late 1800s, and there were millions and millions sold in different languages all across the country, this really opened up a path for magazines. As you started to see with this muckraking, this kind of long-form journalism that we would say today that would investigate some of the major issues and people of the day. Standard Oil Company and John D. Rockefeller. Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and United Steel. The meatpacking industries we'll look at. The insurance industry, all the kind of big companies. And these investigative journalists would dig in and try and find out as much information as they could and then expose that to the public. So that was the goal. And their topics, as I mentioned, varied, and so did their purposes. Some of them were pushing for socialism. Some of them were pushing for anarchism, right, to get rid of government altogether. Others really just believed in the craft as it existed, and that they were doing the people's duty. People like Ray Baker believed that. And I would say its heyday really started in the early 1900s under Teddy Roosevelt because, I think for one part they felt like they had a president who would listen to them. And while he did take pot shots at muckrakers and said that they were just looked at the ills of society, he did, in some instances, listen to them and then enact that change. And I think their demise really came about for several different reasons. And your textbook mentions a couple. One is the idea that this idea of sensationalized journalism that's been going on now in the late 1800s and early 1900s for well over 20 years, people are having a harder and harder time of outdoing the last sensationalist story. So it starts to get boring and in some cases absurd as they push the buck. Others are, you start to see more and more publishers of these magazines, whether they be McClure's, whether they be Puck Magazine or some others, facing more and more increased economic pressure, especially from advertisers and from the people who really would, pay to keep the magazines in business, as they would advocate for big businesses, saying, "Hey, you're kind of, giving us a black eye. You're taking pot shots at us. We're just not going to fund your magazine anymore." So they had to walk that line. The last one is that you started to have more and more of these big companies that would have public relations firms, we'd call them today, that would kind of look to avoid some of these pitfalls so that these things did not happen. So eventually, I would say probably by the early 1900s, by 1910, of course, 1920, you see less and less muckraking. I have some of the people, most famous ones listed on the left here. I would mention, McClure deserves special mention. He's the one who really popularized this idea as a publisher and editor of the magazine McClure's for over 20 years. He came in to America in 1893 as a 36-year-old, and he started McClure's magazine, which was famous for a good 20 years after that. Lincoln Steffens worked for him. Ida B. Tarbell wrote some different articles, most famously taking down Standard Oil, taking some shots. There were a bounty on her head as she was seen as, really exposing that much about Standard Oil. It was dangerous to their business. Upton Sinclair is probably the most, at least well-known or most talked about, and we'll talk about him here coming up shortly, as he is most famously tied to the book The Jungle. Trust busting. What is it? Well, it's something that was very popular in the day, and this is where I would say, boy, there are a lot of ways in which you can look like Teddy Roosevelt, and I think he's like a lot of different presidents, but in this way, using the bully pulpit and trust busting, if you will, so in a lot of ways where he's really a showman, kind of like our soon-to-be President-elect Trump right now. By this point, people looked at businesses. They said trust control over 80% of industry, and this is a problem because it's leading to monopolies, which is leading to inferior products of low quality where people have to pay high prices for them. So it's putting people out of business, and it's bad for the small business, good for the rich to get richer. They want someone to go ahead and act on their behalf, and Teddy Roosevelt's more than happy to take that on. The Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed in 1890 to combat monopolies, is something that really wasn't used at that point, right? And it wasn't used by presidents or politicians up to this point. He goes ahead and takes that on. He does file 44 suits, and many of them were successful against some of the biggest companies that were out there. So this is something where people kind of look at him championing them, right? I mean, he's stepping up on their behalf. As you can see from the political cartoon here, here's Teddy Roosevelt. He's squeezing the money out of these big businesses to give back to the people, as you see an approving Teddy Roosevelt in the background as Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster, goes ahead and takes their money. But again, I would say, did it do much for people? Sometimes, but not too much. What it did though was it showed that here's a guy who would fight for them, and the people really did appreciate that, and they saw him as the trustbuster, even though the guy who takes over after him, Taft, really ends up being much more successful and much more effective and much more antagonistic in that way towards big business. So we've looked at Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster, but really it was Teddy Roosevelt, the steward of the people. Teddy Roosevelt, the man who wanted to give Americans a square deal. And one of those places where Americans felt like they were getting ripped off was the railroads. The railroads was one of the great villains of the day, kind of like you'd say maybe banks are the villains today. And this political cartoon right here really illustrates kind of that battle going on here. Here's the people's champion, Teddy Roosevelt, wearing the stars and stripes, the red, white, and blue, as he's taking on the railroads. The railroad's trying to take him down, but he has the upper hand, willing to go to the mat for the American people. As Uncle Sam, representing America, kind of looks on, wondering how this is all going to turn out. He does have a vested interest. Will the federal government keep the upper hand, or will big business continue and railroads continue to be in charge? The two major pieces of legislation that Teddy Roosevelt puts in place during his time in office are the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act. First, the Elkins Act in 1903, he passes, and it's really seen as, here comes the American government really taking a stand to fight against the railroads. But in essence, what the Elkins Act does is it helps the railroads. Here's what it does. It says that railroads can no longer give rebates to some of the big shippers, right? Some of the big companies like Standard Oil, like U.S. Steel, like some of the great agricultural and grain outfits of the day. Because that's what those places would do, right? Standard Oil would say, sure, we'll use your railroad, right? But you're charging us this rate, that's fine, but we want a big kickback at the end, known as a rebate. So after we use your service, we want you to kick us back a bunch of money. Well, this just, helps out the rich. Obviously, the poor and the middle class and the farmers, they have no power to this. They'll just, if they said that to the railroads and we want a rebate back, the railroads would laugh at them and say, fine, go ahead, use another one. They didn't really have any other ability to do so. But the big businesses knew that they, in essence, kept the railroads going with their business, so they wanted kickbacks for that. This eliminates that. So in some ways, on a minor scale, it hurts big business. What it also does, though, is it helps the railroads, right? I mean, the railroads are able to keep more of their money that they're able to take from these big businesses, and they no longer have to give these kickbacks. But it's a lot of times, the people like that he's fighting against the railroads in this, but it doesn't amount to much. The Hepburn Act, on the other hand, is the second part of this, and this goes much further. The Hepburn Act is passed in 1906, and this really does regulate the railroads. Because remember, that's what Teddy Roosevelt was about. Not in hurting big business. He wants everyone to have a square deal. The rich, the poor, the middle class, go by it honestly and fairly. And he believed that was best done by the government regulating and keeping an eye on these different industries. And that's what he does with the Hepburn Act in 1906. What the Hepburn Act does is it provides the ICC, otherwise known as the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ability to fix maximum rates. Okay, so they're able to say, hey, if you're going to haul something from here to here, this is how much you can charge, essentially, right? You can't charge any more than this, whether it be to big businesses or farmers alike. It also is, again, a commission, one of the favorite things of progressives. It's going to hear complaints from shippers if they have issues. Also, the ICC is going to inspect the railroad's financial records, and then they go ahead and they prescribe kind of a uniform bookkeeping practices, right? This is how it needs to look, so that when we want to come in and look, we can decide if you're acting fairly or not. What it does is it really ends the idea of the railroads being the wild, wild west, that they can set their own rules, and it puts that power back in, or for the first time, in federal government's hands to be able to decide what is fair and what is not. This is a picture that I think we need to look at, because this is essentially Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster, right? This is Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster. Well, he a lot of times gets credit for breaking up all of big business, all of the trust. That's not true. I want you to really zero in on what's going on in this picture. Sure. First, you got Teddy Roosevelt, the willing participant, right? I mean, he's got his gun, he's got his knife, he's got his cowboy hat. He's going out there hunting. He's going out there hunting bears. And as you look at it, you really have, three bears here, if you will, right? You got Teddy Roosevelt on top with his foot on top of the one that says bad trusts. And these are ones that he's going to take down. Okay, he's going to take down. Now, the good trust, as you can see, it's good trust. The bear in the back left is cowering, and it's on a leash, right? And the leash says restraint. That is what Teddy Roosevelt really wanted. It wasn't that he wanted to take down, all the trusts. He just wanted them to be regulated. Again, he was about reforming and regulating rather than getting rid of. So he was for trusts. He just wanted the good trusts, and he believed that the government was really the only one who could keep them on a leash, if you will. Meanwhile, some other trusts were kind of like, look out, as you see the guy in the back right, like this guy is not good for us as he's watching all this kind of go down. Health is where Teddy Roosevelt definitely deserves a lot of credit. Again, he reads The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, and it changes his life, if you will, as he's reading through all the sickening things that are done in the meatpacking industry, and not just how it makes life tough for the people as they can barely make a living, but the conditions, the work conditions in there, and what it's like. You have to understand, this is a time period where people are getting sick, and a lot of people are dying simply because of the food that they're ingesting, okay? So two things that end up coming out of here are the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 and the Pure Food and Drug Act in the same year. The Meat Inspection Act, as TR kind of puts, again, this famous kind of progressive idea, put a bunch of experts to examine the issues. After he reads their recommendations, he comes up with the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. And this leads to these new cleanliness requirements that are involved. This is, when you look today at the people as food is being processed, whether it be chicken or carcasses or eggs or anything else, they kind of got the white coats on, and they're checking it sometimes with a thermometer and other things like that. They would now check all of especially the meat, for example. So if you look at this, today when you go and buy a thing of ground beef because you're going to have burgers that night, one of the first things that I always look at is the best by date, right? It has to served by this date. So that that you're not getting kind of rotten stuff, if you will, right? It has a best by date. The other thing that came out of this, as I mentioned, is the Pure Food and Drug Act. And this halted the sale of contaminated foods and medicines, and it called for something that was called truth in labeling. And this is important. Up to this point, they had what they called caveat emptor, which means, let the buyer beware, which essentially is, hey, once you, as a business or as a person, sell something to another company, it is no longer your problem. It doesn't matter if that device that you sell or that food or that medicine works or doesn't work. If it breaks apart, if it goes bad, that doesn't. If it does cure your ailment, for example, you could go in the back of the room. You could mix turpentine and hairspray and bubble gum and put it all in a jar and go ahead and sell it as, hey, this is going to cure baldness. And you didn't have to have someone saying, yes, that's exactly what it does. You didn't have to have that. You could have it. I could be taking it because I'm bald, rub it all over my head. In 2 weeks, I come back. I got these nasty, scars and lesions. And I'm kind of like, well, what's going on? If I went back to you and said I want my money back, and in fact, I want compensation for some of these issues that have occurred since I've been using your product, I would get laughed at, right? And there would be no compensation for me because I bought it, right? Once that purchase is made, that's over. That's it. And so now it calls for truth in labeling that, boy, if you say it's going to do this, it needs to do it. And this leads to the beginning of what we have today, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, where they have to approve it for you to be able to use, certain drugs. They have to approve it for some of these foods to be seen as legal and so on and so forth, okay? But again, this is that progressive idea of labeling is what it's really all about. That's what they want to regulate. Arguably, Teddy Roosevelt's greatest achievements were with the environment. He really is, in a lot of ways, our first environmental president, and in many ways is the most successful in helping the environment and shaping it the way that it is today. Before Teddy Roosevelt, the federal government really had little, if anything, to do with the natural resources for many different reasons. One is because big business would pressure them and would buy up all the lands and use it up. And most politicians at this point looked at, boy, the way for America to be successful was through big business making us great, making us a powerhouse economically, and whatever they need we'll give them. So in a lot of ways, those companies would use and abuse the land, right, at the cost of just trying to make a profit. And by 1900, the United States is certainly facing a natural environment disaster on their hands. Farmers have raped and pillaged the land, especially the Midwest, through the Homestead Act in 1862 up until 1900. We studied this earlier. Hundreds of thousands of people take up millions of acres of land, and they farm land that was kind of virgin land before that. And they're destroying it. They're not taking care of it. They're not irrigating properly, and they're not replenishing it. And so that land's being destroyed. Ranchers are doing the same in that same area and out west as well. And coal and lumber companies really just have the run of it as their runoff from the coal, and the old lumber is just kind of being piled up to the side. There is no eco-friendly way to dispose of these things, and there's no need to, right? Because there's nothing on the land, and they're literally ruining land with no repercussions. You're seeing the same thing happen in big cities and in factories as the excess from factories, the stuff that's pumped out is just dumped right into the rivers. In big cities, people are dumping garbage from their windows. There is no sanitation system. There is no sewer system really until the early 1900s. There is no garbage, system that's really working universally. So we're literally a mass in garbage and disease by this point. Teddy Roosevelt tries to avert a disaster, and while he is invested in kind of some of these issues going on in the cities, as he came from New York City, I think it's his love of the West and the country that really lead him to conserve and protect a lot of these beautiful natural resources that we have out there, from Yellowstone Park and the redwoods to the Grand Canyon and some of the other beautiful rivers and valleys out west as well. As you can see, some of his accomplishments down here below. Maybe most importantly, you could even say his most important legacy was creating the Forest Reserve Service. And this is where we have our forest rangers today and a lot of the national parks that we still have today. And the head of the U.S. Forest Service is Gifford Pinchot, right? As you see him, he's up here, up top with Teddy Roosevelt in his top hat. Pinchot was really an advocate and conservationist. Okay, down below you see Teddy Roosevelt up here, I believe, in one of our famous landmarks with another famous natural preservationist, and that's John Muir. He's more famous. He has his own park and many other things out in California. Teddy Roosevelt was a conservationist, right? A conservationist is someone who believes that people should be able to enjoy these natural beauties that are out there and be a part of them. Go and camp in Yellowstone Park or Glacier or some of these other places. A preservationist, on the other hand, believes that the government still has a role to protect all these different lands, but that people shouldn't be able to utilize them, right? They should be able to stay in their natural habitat without people necessarily invading or enjoying them, however you look at that. Were the progressives successful in a lot of different areas? Absolutely. Did they miss the boat on some very important topics? There's no doubt about it. And while we've talked about the progressives being a wide variety of different people with different aims, taking on different topics, everywhere from prohibition to women getting the right to vote, to being against child labor, to the environment, to the health and safety of people. When you look at some of these other issues, the federal government certainly fell short, and the one most glaring issue is with civil rights. As we look at this time period, 1900, really even into 1920, for sure, this is known as the nadir of African American life. That's the low point. This is the era of Jim Crow, where separate but equal kind of rules the day, and African Americans really are treated and seen as second-class citizens. Teddy Roosevelt does kind of pay it lip service. Teddy Roosevelt does give it some window treatment as he invites Booker T. Washington to the White House to have a White House dinner, first African American to go ahead and do that, be officially invited for a White House dinner. But this was a symbolic gesture. And in fact, Teddy Roosevelt gets so much blowback from some of his Southern constituents that something like this never happens again. And he never really tries to right the wrongs of society before. He does nothing as far as African Americans concerns about anti-lynching laws or getting rid of some of these Jim Crow laws. He does not venture there. And in fact, it gets even worse with successive presidents as you look at Woodrow Wilson, who takes over in 1912, and he's just an outright bigot, towards African Americans. So while we look at the many gains during this time period for Americans, one major negative is certainly the progressive presidents dealing with, or lack of dealing with, civil rights. 1912, oftentimes titled the Great Campaign, it really was one of the greatest presidential campaigns of all time. So how did we get here? Well, Teddy Roosevelt, again, as he said in 1904, he promised, I will not, run for president again in 1908, even though he could do it constitutionally. It was a blunder, his greatest political blunder, and it's probably one of the few sentences he wishes he could take back and not say. But when he did say it, he made that promise to the American people, and when he had the choice in 1908 to either run again or not, he did not want to go against his word. So what did he do? Well, he handpicked his successor. He chooses William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft was his Secretary of War and one of his really good friends. William Howard Taft was a progressive and a conservative, right? He kind of married those two parts of the Republican Party very well. And Taft ends up winning a big victory in 1908. Teddy Roosevelt sees his man in the White House, and Teddy Roosevelt basically goes off the grid. He goes to Africa on a year-long safari. He goes and does some other things, and he's not involved. But as he hears more and more reports about how things are going from some of his progressive friends, he does become frustrated. And as he starts to get more and more engaged, as he comes back to America and hangs out in 1910 and starts to be more involved in the political process, he starts to criticize William Howard Taft, both personally and politically. And it really does lead to a rift in the Republican Party as conservatives and businessmen and Republican establishment types really rally around William Howard Taft, who they look at as their champion. And you have the progressives, right, from the Republican Party really rally around Teddy Roosevelt. Again, you could see this problem coming from miles away, that somehow conservatives and progressives were not always going to get along, and this is where it comes to a boiling point at this period. Teddy Roosevelt officially breaks away when he does not win the Republican nomination, and he creates, what's called the Bull Moose parties. He said he feels like a bull moose, and he starts this progressive party, this third party, and he calls for, he runs on a platform of new nationalism, saying that the federal government should exert its power for the welfare of the people even more actively than it had in the past. He becomes all of a sudden even more progressive, if you will, whereas before he might argue and say that he was conservative, that he just wanted to regulate, he just wanted to help when he needed to here and there for the people. Now he really wanted the federal government to have an even more active role in people's day-to-day lives and some of the big decisions that were out there. And while his new nationalism, as we look at this platform today, 100 years later, we can look at it and say, boy, that it doesn't look too progressive or too wild to me. 100 years ago, this was seen as extremely liberal, as extremely, proactive, if you will. Right? He calls for the direct election of senators. He's going to take that power away from party bosses and state bosses. That ends up being passed, within the next 10 years. And with the 17th Amendment, he calls for women's suffrage, women to have the right to vote, and the federal government to defend that, not just on a state basis, but on a national basis. That comes to fruition with the 19th Amendment within the next 10 years. He calls for the 8-hour workday, right? Something that we look at as standard today. He calls for minimum wage for women and a federal law against child labor. As you saw more and more businesses really kind of abuse, in some ways, women and children because they could pay them less because they didn't have to worry about their working conditions necessarily, and they would use them. And this would hurt families, this would hurt women, it would hurt men that were looking for those jobs. So he calls for a change to that, and he calls for a Federal Trade Commission to be around to regulate business on a normal basis. They have a permanent body to look at different businesses and seeing if they're playing by the rules, if you will. What happens is not really a surprise. As we get here, you got Eugene V. Debs, who runs for president as well as a socialist. He's gaining more and more traction among especially factory workers, union types. He pulls in 500,000 to 1 million votes. But then Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft split the Republican vote, right? They split the party wide. And that allows Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic nominee, who is the governor of New Jersey at the time, to go ahead and win. Only the second governor, the second Democrat to become president since the Civil War. So Woodrow Wilson becomes president as we move into March of 1913, and he is president through really the end of the Progressive Era, which ends, I would say, essentially with World War II kind of getting going, and then the end of his term, if you want to look at it that way, 1920. But a little bit about Woodrow Wilson. I'm not going to go into him as extensively as I did with Teddy Roosevelt. But Woodrow Wilson grew up in Virginia during the Civil War, so he's a Southerner. He's only the second Democrat since the Civil War to be elected, to be president. He's the first Southerner in the White House since 1850. Okay, so we haven't even had a Southerner since before the Civil War started. He's very much the academic. He's very much a progressive in the way that when we think about progressives and their idea that every problem has a solution. If you just put a bunch of experts there, logic will pull us through and show us the way. He was, president of Princeton University and ends up running. He's governor of New Jersey, and he's maybe even more than Teddy Roosevelt, if that's possible. He's even more confident in his ability to persuade. That if he could just talk to the people, that they will listen to him and will listen to his reason and see that it's sound and agree with him. And in a lot of ways, up to this point, that was certainly the case. What we'll find more as we look at World War I in a couple weeks is, while that works in some cases, maybe with Congress and others, senators don't like to be bullied around and will push back, even if it is for petty motives. And we'll see that in the future. But right away, he runs under, so he sees Teddy Roosevelt running under this flag of new nationalism. He runs under something called New Freedom. He really understands the sentiment that's out there that people are sick of big businesses taking advantage of them, and they feel like they're not being treated fairly. He sees the power of Teddy Roosevelt's the idea of the square deal, giving people a square deal. And he calls with his New Freedom saying that he's going to attack the triple wall of privilege. And he takes special aim at the tariffs, banks, and trusts, all easy punching bags for Americans by this point. So what is Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom? Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom, as we mentioned before, kind of took aim at the triple wall of privilege of tariffs, banking, and business. Okay? And just to kind of tick these off, what's interesting is, as we talked about kind of how he's very much an academic, as you can't even see in his glasses there, how he believed in his abilities to persuade. He does something where he breaks precedent, and he goes ahead and right when he becomes president, he calls a special session of Congress. He calls them in to speak to them. He's the first president to call that special session of Congress since John Adams, right, our second president of the United States. And he calls and directly pleads with them that he wants to, lower tariffs and introduce, a more progressive income tax. And he does just that, right? I mean, the 16th Amendment was already kind of set to pass, and he does that. But the one change, again, that starts under Abraham Lincoln, the one change to the income tax is something, again, that's we look at today as vital and important in our economic system. This idea of progressive income tax is the idea that if you make more money, you should be taxed at a higher rate. There shouldn't be what we call a flat tax to where everyone pays, for example, 10%. The people that are doing better because of, a lot of times because of government initiatives are expected to pay a little bit more. That's tied in directly with the Underwood tariff and the importance of the tariff. This is something a lot of Americans have been fighting for really generations. this idea that we need to lower the tariff because what it's doing is, from a business standpoint, it's hurting, especially our Southerners, right? Remember, he's from the South, and our Westerners, those people that are forced to then buy a lot of times inferior products from the Northeast manufacturers at a higher price. Now this kind of puts them on notice, and this helps out a huge segment of, especially the Democratic Party. This is something that William um, Jennings Bryan's been fighting for over 20 years now, and now they're able to pass it. It's kind of a win for the South, if you will. As far as banking goes, he again calls Congress together. He wants to pass this as well, and he takes his message, straight to them. He feels like, in many ways, that the public interest is not being served, and that Wall Street has just too much power. So he calls, and he's able to get Congress to pass what's called the Federal Reserve Act, which gives us the banking system that we have today. It creates a Federal Reserve Board in 12, different district banks, if you will, that are supervised by this board. And ever since this point, we've had kind of the monetary system that we have today, as far as the dollar bills being in circulation and so on and so forth. And last of this triple wall privilege that he wanted to attack was businesses, okay, if you will, or as he mentioned, trusts. And a couple major pieces of legislation come out of this. One is the Clayton Antitrust Act, which really strengthens, if you will, and helps the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had so many holes in it. This really strengthens that up and gives it some more teeth, if you will. And then he also passes the Federal Trade Commission. He establishes this organization, and their job is basically, as Teddy Roosevelt looked at, to look at what's unfair and what's not, as far as our trading is going. Is it good for the American people, or is it just good for some of these individual businesses? So that's where we're going to leave it here today. We've looked, at the progressive era with a major focus on Teddy Roosevelt. We will look more and more at Woodrow Wilson as we get into World War I, and then also imperialism will look more and more at Teddy Roosevelt and kind of his foreign pursuits going forward. But from the progressive standpoint, just to kind of put a bow on it, the progressive era was a direct reaction, I believe, to the Gilded Age before that, where big business kind of ran the show and government stayed out of the way. The progressive is kind of a course correction to that, where the federal government, state governments, local governments got very involved in people's lives, trying to make it better. Sometimes they were able to achieve that. Sometimes they got in the way. And sometimes, as you saw with civil rights, they just didn't even deal with the problem at all. Overall, the progressives were a consequential group of people. And there's someone I think we can learn a lot from today, as you kind of see America in a lot of people would argue similar circumstances as the progressives faced in the early 1900s, right? The rise of big business. You'd look at today the idea of banks being too big to fail, right? And having to bail them out. The idea of some of the social ills we have. They dealt with their civil rights issues back then. We have, whether it be Black Lives Matter or African American males, and the problems that they're having with a lot of police departments. So a lot of the issues that they had back then we're still dealing with today, and we should probably look to them as a guide as to the things that they did well and the things that they failed at as we go forward in our decision-making process. All right, that's it. See you later.